Hi, and welcome to the Lensrentals podcast, where we talk about images and the people who make them. I'm Roger Sakala, the founder of Lensrentals.com. Welcome to the Lensrentals podcast. Today we're going to talk about how to break your lens, or really how to avoid breaking your lens. With me in studio today is Joey Miller, Lensrentals Senior Technical Advisor who assesses most broken equipment, and Aaron Close, Lensrentals Repair Department Manager. Let's start with what is broken, because that's a really broad thing. We see broken as in how many pieces is it in, and we see broken as in it looks fine, but it's not working, and everything in between. So, Joey, since you're usually the point man on broken, what do you commonly see as broken lenses?
Sure. For the most part, a broken lens is pretty black and white. There are rare instances where it's just slight optical misalignments that are kind of hard to tell sometimes. But most of the time it's jammed rings, like focus or zoom rings, broken barrels, loose barrels, scratched lenses, autofocus motors that don't work, apertures that don't work. Mechanical breakdowns are the most obvious.
Right.
Electronic breakdowns are the second most obvious.
And anything you can imagine going wrong, we've seen it.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah, everything.
Whether it's the customer's fault or whether it's just because we're shipping these things all the time.
So, Joey, you're the one that usually sees, hey, I've got this lens from you guys and it's just not working anymore.
Yeah.
What are you usually seeing in that situation?
Most common for Canon is an error 01, which usually aperture failure, but sometimes it's just pure electronic failure. If you get the aperture readout says 00 on the top of your camera, that's a dead lens, almost always. Otherwise, if it's an aperture failure, it'll not trigger unless you stop down.
Okay.
And then for Nikon, haven't seen too much issues with the electronic apertures on those, but when they fail, they're just dead.
So if I understood you right, your Canon aperture fails, you can still shoot wide open?
Usually.
Okay.
Yeah,
When your
very
Nikon
often.
aperture fails, not so much.
No. If an Nikon aperture fails, it's usually mechanical, unless it's the new the E lenses. And those are electronic, but I think most of the time you can still shoot wide open with those too.
I think what we run into, though, is that more and more these lenses, when they're not on the camera,
Mhm.
they sort of default to closing that aperture down to protect a mirrorless camera sensor. So if that happens, and then as soon as you mount it and turn the camera on, it tries to open that aperture up, it's going to fail.
So that's different than it would have been 5 or 6 years ago.
Right.
Okay.
Sony's just like to die.
There's one other, Sony's just die. And they tend to be just electronically dead.
Yeah, they'll just be electronically dead. You'll see F on the camera readout, and AF doesn't work. Nothing works.
And there's one other subset of electronic failure that I think is a little more subtle sometimes, and that's stabilization failure, whether it's IS or VR.
Yeah, and that, two different options there. Either it's electronically dead or it's making loud buzzing noise because it's just messed up mechanically.
They're rattling around in its cage, so to speak. Yeah, sometimes it seems like, obviously, you hear this horrible noise and your pictures are blurry because the unit's moving randomly. But are there some where the IS has stopped working and you're taking good pictures but not getting stabilization? Do you ever see that?
Oh, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that happens sometimes.
It's a little more subtle to pick up on.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're shooting at high enough shutter speeds that you wouldn't notice anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that we do get lenses back where the customer says, I don't think it was stabilizing. And when you look through the viewfinder with it on, you can tell it's not stabilizing. Like it's not smooth or anything, but it still works otherwise.
While we're on the topic, what's your check for that when somebody says, where you think it's not stabilizing properly?
Most of the time I can see stabilization through the viewfinder. On wide angle lenses, it's a little harder usually, but if you can see and it also depends on the brand. Third parties like Sigma and Tamron, it's a little harder to see because like I don't know why. I don't know why their stabilizers are weird, but they're weird. Like Canon, Nikon, Sony, all of those are super easy to see. Oh, it is obviously stabilizing, especially when you zoom to a long end. You can see it just kind of a buttery motion as you move around.
How about the sound part of it? I used to be in the old days with the first generation stabilizer. We'd listen to see if it was.
Yeah, that's usually the very first thing I do. Turn the stabilizer on and stick my ear right to the barrel. If you can hear it buzzing, like humming a little bit, it's working, or at least it's trying to work.
Right. It's electronically intact.
Yes.
And I think that's where you start to notice a lot of differences between the manufacturers, because they do have very different ways of pulling this off.
Mhm.
And so some will have more of a sort of motorized grinding sound. Some will have more of a hum.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really does help to kind of understand how that particular manufacturer pulls these things off, so that you can more accurately tell whether that's a normal sound for that particular lens.
And it can change within manufacturers too.
Oh, that's a good point.
Not all Canons sound the same.
That's very true.
They all sound similar. And they all sound the same when they fail. But
The other thing that I get asked constantly is about scratched glass. You'd think glass scratches happen spontaneously, and they might, for all I know. When do you start going, oh, this is an insignificant scratch, this is a significant scratch?
oh boy.
Joey, you go first.
It's a point of contention with all the text figuring out what we pass and what we don't. The typical answer is if you can't see it without a light and it's not very much, like there aren't very many of the scratches, then we will typically call that insignificant. If you can see it easily without a light, like without like a spotlight, we use these LED spotlights when we're testing. If you can see it without that, or you can drag your fingernail and it catches, that is definitely a significant scratch. If it's insignificant visually, but it's impacting images, like it flares, or usually it's just flare or ghosting, then we would also call that significant. So if it's impacting images, or you can physically see it and feel it, we would call that significant enough. Whereas it may not really impact images significantly, it is cosmetically ugly, and we will replace that.
Aaron, you get sent the lenses with scratches to test for flaring. So tell everybody kind of what you do, because a lot of that they could do.
Sure. So the one thing I'll point out is that a lot of what we're doing is preventative, in the way that we're trying to eliminate any sort of paranoia that our customers might have when they receive this lens. Because it's very difficult to draw a line and say this type of scratch will affect your image and this will not. Because I guarantee if you try, you can find that scratch in an image somehow, with a light directed straight at it, stopped all the way down. It'll show in some way most of the time, not always.
Yeah, especially on a wide lens.
But yes, wide lenses, like if you have a zoom, oftentimes you will see it at the wider end of the zoom, but not the tele end of the zoom. But what we're trying to do is send something to someone that they can feel very comfortable using. And so when we start testing for flare, we're taking a lot of things into account.
Well, if Joe Smith at home gets a scratch on his front element, would you say just take some pictures and see if it shows up, or was there something you would suggest to him as try this, that'll stress your flare if it's going to happen a little bit?
Sure. So it's important to note that most of the time it's not going to affect your image whatsoever, because most people are not stopping these lenses down and putting themselves in a scenario where there's a very bright light source within the field of view.
F8 shooting into the sun would.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we talk about cinema lenses and you're actually panning across a scene, that does become very important. But for many photographers, it's less so. And so what you can do is set up a scenario that's similar to how you usually shoot. Or if you're just a very versatile photographer, then you just want to find out what that scratch that you're seeing is doing, period, just so you can know how to avoid it. You're simply stopping the lens all the way down, taking a very bright light source and sort of panning around your lens in a way.
While we're talking about scratches, over the years, we've changed our thinking about filters for protective purposes only, not talking about any other reason whatsoever. Some lenses, of course, need them for sealing, et cetera, but for protective purposes only, not Lensrentals policy, what are your individual feelings about whether or not you would filter your lenses?
No filters for me.
No filters for Joey. Aaron?
Same.
I'll filter in conditions that are difficult, sandy, windy, muddy. And we have the advantage of knowing which few lenses, they're not a lot yet, but it's more and more, have aspherical front elements, and I'll filter those.
And I also always use hoods.
Good point.
Yeah, I feel like that's almost a better mode of protection. But I think in general, yes, if you're somewhere that's very dusty or you're at the beach or something, then the filter's really kind of a good way to go because it may be an expensive front element, but you also just don't want to go through the hassle of having to get something done.
Joey, why do you usually not use a filter?
I don't like them. It's a
that was a scientific response.
It's a psychological thing. I don't want to spend the money to get a good enough filter that it won't impact anything. I don't want to deal with flares and ghosting potential. If I get a lens, I'm getting it for, like, most of the lenses I'm using are old ass lenses anyway, so they don't really need filters for protection. If I get more scratches on them, it's just more character for my stuff, which is fine. But yeah, filters, it's just one extra thing in my bag. I don't want it. I don't like it. I'm psychologically trained against it, and I hate them. That's
okay.
it.
And for those who don't know, Joey tends to shoot old, broken junk cameras.
Old film cameras,
yeah.
Antiques, typically.
Aaron, what about you? Why do you prefer not filters?
I tend to choose a lens based on its optical formula. I want to shoot with it because of how it was designed, and putting anything else in front of it kind of bothers me. Okay. And I'm also just not that paranoid about scratches.
Let's also talk about what you shoot.
Well, sure. I'm usually shooting Leica. In fact, I only ever shoot Leica.
Right. So
rangefinders. And so as far as getting a good quality filter is not a big deal because we're talking about very small filters. But I in particular even tend towards the older designs just because I want to avoid the aspherics. I like the more classic
So you'll shoot the older lens so you don't feel the need to put a filter in front of it.
Indeed.
All right, we talked about ways lenses get damaged. Let's talk about the quickest way to destroy a lens.
Ooh, buddy.
So when you hear somebody's doing what, do you think, Joey, that the lens is going to come back broken?
If they tell me they're going to Burning Man.
Absolutely.
If they tell me they're going to the desert, or if they tell me they're going anywhere near a beach or the ocean.
Okay. There are probably other things that are bad to do, but how much above all other things are those four that you mentioned?
Oh, by a factor of 5, at least.
Aaron, you have anything to add on those?
I think just that the most common factor there is either high moisture or, yes, sand, dust, very fine particles that get inside crevices and things like that.
Back in the day when I did what you guys do now, I used to say that all the lenses who came back just dead, we don't know why, I could look and see that it was in a coastal city that it had gone to.
Oh, yeah.
And I think everybody is aware that salt water is not water. You can have a weather resistant lens, and that's great for some rain. Salt water's different.
Yeah, salt water corrodes anything metal. If somebody calls and says, "Yeah, I get hit by a wave," or I dropped it in the ocean or I got some sea mist while I was on a boat. As soon as it comes back, it's almost always covered in white stuff.
Yeah. Inside and out.
Yeah.
And there's a time factor there too. So it may come back and be seemingly fine and functioning, but give it a little time and yes, let electronics start to fail.
I think that people don't think about lenses, but there's a rule about you don't buy a used car from a coastal city. I wouldn't buy a lens from a coastal city either. And I think even if it's not been splashed, there is salt mist in the air constantly, and that tends to find a way. What about sand? People think about sand. We've had lenses come back where the front element looks pitted from sand, but sand does more than that.
It gets in rings, makes them gritty. And anytime you've got more abrasive stuff in there, that's just bad all around. It can get caught in seals, get caught in caps. Right.
So we're going to talk about actual repairs later, but Aaron, you do this a lot. You have techs who do this a lot. How long does it take you on a small, average, cheap lens to get sand out? How many hours?
It's, I'll say it's at least 1 hour for a very simple lens, because you can look to essentially completely disassemble the lens to remove that sand, because if you leave even a single grain, it's quite noticeable and it does more damage. So you basically have to take it all apart, at least the external portions, which if anybody's seen a lot of our teardowns, you kind of understand what that means. There's outer barrels and then there's inner moving parts, and you only hope that it didn't make it too far in. But it's not a matter of just scooping some out without disassembly. You can't just take a wet cloth and wipe it down and hope to get it out of there.
Okay, let's take a break, and we will come back and talk about actual repairing broken stuff.
Welcome back to another Employee Spotlight, this time with our own Ryan Hill.
Hey, how's it going?
What do you do here, Ryan?
I do kind of a lot. My title on paper is Video Product Development Specialist. So that's a lot of things. I sort of seek out new things for us to carry, and then in the discussion of whether we're trying to carry something new, I kind of chime in on that, what would be the advantages and disadvantages, and then once we have something new in, I help decide how we're going to inspect it, how we're going to support it, what sort of accessories we need, how we're going to market it, things like that.
All right. That sounds pretty cool. So you're responsible for all that crazy new stuff we get for video stuff.
Yeah. Not all of it, but I at least have a hand in there. Yeah.
A good chunk of it.
Right.
So what did you do before you worked at Lensrentals?
I did a lot of stuff. I was a bartender for a little while. I drove a FedEx truck for a little while, but an experience that speaks to this job in particular, I was a PA for a long time in like film industry in North Carolina, and after that, camera assistant, locations assistant. I did a little bit of AD work, stuff like that.
So you did real video stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me about working on Eastbound and Down.
Okay, so Joey asked me that question because we've talked about this before. My main, my longest job and the thing that I worked on that probably the most people have seen is Eastbound and Down. I worked on that when I was living in Wilmington, North Carolina, and it was really fun. How
cool is Danny McBride in person?
Danny McBride was a very nice guy. And David Gordon Green, also very nice guy. I have a story about getting that job that I guess is appropriate for the podcast.
You should tell that story.
Joey has heard this story before, but if you don't want to hear about marijuana, the story involves marijuana a little bit. So I got the job I found a Craigslist ad. As I'd gone to film school, so I have a little bit of editing experience. found a Craigslist ad from a grip who was like, hey, I need somebody to teach me how to edit. I'm working on like a project. I'll pay you. So I messaged this guy and was like, hey, instead of paying me, I will teach you how to edit for free, because I found out he worked on Eastbound and Down. I will teach you how to edit for free if you like put my name in for a gig, because I need a job desperately and I like this show very much. So taught him how to edit. He talked to one of the ADs and got me brought on for like a free sort of just tryout day. I'm not getting paid for this day. I'm just getting brought to set and kind of see if I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to like show up on time and not drunk or something like that. So the shoot day, it's like a big party scene. There are bikers everywhere. This is specifically season 3 of Eastbound and Down. We're shooting in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So when I show up 6 a.m, they're prepping for this huge party scene. There are coolers of fake beer everywhere. There's like 100 extras. It's one of their bigger shooting days. And the prop master was out sick. And AD is running around desperately because they have a plastic box full of rolling papers and a plastic box full of fake marijuana. You don't buy fake prop joints. You buy fake prop weed and then wrap it yourself. And none of the props people knew how to roll a joint.
I find that very difficult.
It was incredible. And I'm sure this was breaking union rules somehow, so don't come after me, the Teamsters.
Years later.
Yeah. So, but, the AD was running around going, who knows how to roll a joint? Who knows how to roll a joint? I'm like, I know how to roll a joint. I can roll a joint for you. And I'm not getting paid today. So he was like, sit down at this table, roll as many joints as you can in 8 hours. And that's what I did. And that's how I got my first job.
You got your first job by rolling 8 hours worth of joints.
Yeah, I texted my parents immediately.
That's a lot of
I
joints.
was like, I got my first real adult like film job because I know how to roll a joint.
So since you do all the new stuff, what's your favorite new piece of gear that we carry that you like to use?
Ooh, that's a really good question. You know what? I have an answer for this. These are not on our site as of like me talking right now, but probably by the time this gets put in an episode, these will be available for rent. Quasar Science QLED lights.
Oh, they are really cool.
Yeah, and they've been out for a while, but we just picked them up, and they're like 4-foot long LED tubes. They're battery powered. It's a full RGB spectrum. They're controllable with like remote DMX. And they're super bright for how large they are. They're easy to control, and I think they're a really flexible resource. Like you can use them as like an on-screen source, or they're bright enough to be used as like a traditional light. We carry a frame that puts 4 of them on top of each other in sort of like a Kino LED setup. They're awesome, and they're not too expensive.
Yeah, I think they're going to rent well.
They're really, really great.
If you didn't work here, what do you think you'd be doing right now?
Ooh.
If you could do anything.
I wouldn't be doing this because I don't have the expertise or the constitution for it. But when I was a kid, I desperately wanted to be a National Geographic photographer. Oh. I think that's probably a common trait with like anybody who works here. I had a National Geographic subscription. I was just like, oh my God, that is the dream job. I just want to like have a camera and one of those fucking vests that holds like 90 rolls of film and like travel around and take very, very good pictures. But I'm not capable of doing that expertise wise.
Yeah, I feel that. I think I would do that too. And this has been an Employee Spotlight. Thanks for listening in.
All right, we're back, and we're going to talk now about repairs, something most people don't want to deal with, but everybody eventually is going to deal with. As I said online, you'll hear somebody that said, I had one fixed, or I had 2 and neither one broke, and I'm talking to people who've handled 20,000 or more repairs over the last few years. So let's talk about repairs. You guys handle so many. Let's do some generalities first. Depending on what a manufacturer's system is, we do some repairs in-house. We send some in. Let's talk about where you send lenses. And let's be blunt. Sometimes you have a manufacturer that does quick, great repairs, sometimes not so much. So let's do a quick rundown. manufacturers starting from biggest, which would be Canon, and go from there as to overall what their repair system's like. If you do anything special when you send things in for repair, what you expect back from them. Aaron?
Sure. Yeah, I think that in general, with the bigger name manufacturers, you have some reliable service set up. Canon, in particular, is very fast and consistently reliable.
Define fast for me.
So, okay, that's good because I'm comparing it to, say, Nikon.
Okay.
And it's not just these two in particular that I would compare, but they're big names. They're familiar to a lot of people. And there's a huge difference in what they could expect from those service centers. Canon, we're talking about within a week turnaround, and it would easily be regularly 4 times that for Nikon.
So Canon a week, Nikon a month?
Yes.
Okay, that's some good standards for us to look at. These are, of course, U.S. repair times. We don't do other countries, but it's probably similar other places. All right, so go some more. We just turnaround times.
So I think those are both pretty good examples because usually you're dealing with one that's trying to get it back to you within a week or so. And you have another that has other concerns, whatever they may be. And you're looking at more like a month, 2 months out to repair. And it has a lot to do with their philosophy in how they choose to service things, but also how they manufacture things. A lot of the time we're waiting because parts are not as available or a service center chooses to rework parts rather than replace them. And then you run into companies, say Leica, where if we have a repair going to Leica, we could expect it to be 6 months. It could be longer than that because if we need something replaced, like a piece of glass, well, they only do those in batches for most of their lenses. So they have to wait until they have a reason to do that next batch, or they're scheduled to do that next batch before they have something to replace it with. And most of the time, they're one of those companies that's going to rework the entire thing.
Okay, so we've gotten Canon, Nikon. Sony's a little different because Canon and Nikon have factory service in the U.S., although Nikon's is not really anymore. Leica has factory service in Germany, so things are going over there.
A few things here.
A few things here. What about Sony does not have a true factory service in the U.S.? So what does that kind of turn around and where are things going there?
So probably my favorite service center. I have no problem saying it.
Yeah.
But Phototech in New York City, or in New Jersey. They do not just do Sony, but they do a lot of Sony work. They do a lot of Nikon work.
Mm-hmm.
But
they're authorized factory for both of them.
Yes, and they absolutely pride themselves on fast turnaround time, but more importantly on quality. And they're very good at both. And it's a family-run business, and they treat their employees extremely well, and it shows in the work. It's not, based on a time limit. They just do what needs to be done, and however long it takes, by whatever means, and they do it very, very well.
What is their turnaround time for a Sony lens?
They're within the week.
Okay. Now, they're a Nikon service center. What if you send your Nikon lens to them rather than to Nikon?
It's actually much faster.
Okay.
And
still have the parts limitation if there's a part problem.
Sure. Yeah. But they're very well stocked.
Okay. So we've talked about turnaround times with several manufacturers. And of course, those are our times. We're a big customer for repair centers. We may be a little faster than others. We may be a little slower. Some of them probably don't like us. I don't know.
That could be very true. And I think just using it as a general gauge, though, it tells you something about their personality.
I agree. So we've kind of done the big three and put out a plug that just because your lens is under warranty doesn't mean you have to send it COD the manufacturer. If there's a warranted repair service that you know of and you like, you can send it directly to them and you'll get the same warranty repair as you would from the manufacturer's input. We talked about general how different labels are repaired. But let's talk of types of repair, because it's a lot different replacing an IS unit and optically adjusting a lens and replacing the whole focus assembly, et cetera. So what kinds of things do you go, I'm going to send this in, it's going to come back, it's going to be great? What kinds of repairs do you say, I'm going to send this in, it's going to come back, and I need to really check and make sure it was done right?
That has a lot to do with how a lens is designed, because some categories of lenses, whether it be from the same manufacturer or different manufacturer, they will either be designed to be serviced or not to be serviced.
And what does it mean when it's not designed to be serviced?
So you end up with a lot of larger subassemblies that have already been adjusted in factory. So they're meant to just be swapped out for what's there.
So, for example, you have a scratched front element, but they may actually be replacing the first 6 elements because they're in a subassembly.
Sure. And we're starting to see more and more of that, especially with wide-angle zooms. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the time, if you have, say the newest Canon 16-35 is a good example. If you scratch the front element on those, you're actually replacing quite a bit of the inner components just because they come as a fully assembled, optically adjusted unit.
And I assume that means it's a significant portion of the cost of a new lens.
Absolutely.
Would you say half?
Close to it.
Okay. I think that's one of the things that people get shocked at a lot these days.
Sure. So you have lenses like that. We can throw the Sony 70-200 GM in there if you like.
Okay.
But I think that's an entirely different topic on its own.
That's maybe too specific for this talk. But there are lenses that if you need it repaired, it's going to cost at least half of what the lens costs.
Indeed. And it's because they're extremely complicated, of course, but it's also because they did not take into account when they were designing it how they could break it into smaller sub-assemblies that are adjustable and serviceable. And that's where you see the difference with a lot of the higher-end lenses for cinema. A lot of... So take higher-end cinema lenses, for example. They're meant to be used in really extreme situations over long periods of time, and they're extremely expensive. It's not the kind of thing that you just want to replace when you're done with it.
So they're designed to be repaired.
Yes.
And you can buy any single piece.
They realize that even just the use of this equipment, what it was designed to be used for, will cause hazard to the lens most of the time. Mm-hmm. And so they have built into the equation, this will have to be serviced regularly. Depending on the complexity of a photo lens that is not on the same level,
right,
you can certainly build in this serviceability.
But do they?
Not always.
All right, we talked about probably too much really complex things, but I'm always surprised some things that are always straightforward and fairly quick to do, like my IS went bad, and it comes back in 3 days, and it's always fine again, and it didn't take much time, and it wasn't really ridiculously expensive. What about other things that are pretty quick, straightforward, don't freak out repairs? I'm guessing aperture assemblies usually are that way?
Yes, except that it takes a while to get to them usually. Okay. Aperture assembly is one of the last things to come out usually. You've got everything else sandwiched around it.
So the lens disassembly and reassembly is expensive.
That's about it, but otherwise just plugging it in, yeah.
Anything else that comes to mind that is usually a pretty straightforward, reasonable price for repair?
Sure. Most of the time, any kind of glass that you would have scratched, either the rear element or the front element, that's
It's not too bad.
easy to access. If it requires some adjustment, it's something that's easily accessible and can be done pretty quickly.
Except a few wide angle zooms you mentioned earlier.
Except for those.
Okay. These days, a lot of lenses have linear electromagnetic focusing motors. A lot have ring motors that have been kind of the standard for a decade. Any real difference in expense or complexity of replacing those units?
I would say the ring type is going to be less expensive just because it tends to be its own assembly and it kind of fits around things. The other types have the optics built into them, into the same subassembly. And so you just run into the problems we've been discussing where you have lots of glass, you have lots of assemblies that have to match up with each other and electronic adjustments to be made.
If my ring motor needs to be replaced, the lens probably doesn't need an optical adjustment. But if my linear electromagnetic focusing motor needs to be replaced, the lens probably does need optical adjustment.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So we talked about all these different repairs, and they're kind of complex. What kind of repairs can people do at home?
I mean, I do some of those.
Okay. Give your qualifications because I want to make sure people understand what their own capabilities are and what they can take.
Sure. Since I'm dealing with things coming back that customers have reported or sometimes haven't reported, I am trying not to send things to repair to Aaron and our other repair techs that would just be kind of a waste of time. One, from a clerical standpoint, I don't want to have to like enter it all into the system and then walk it over and then have someone else look it up and go through things. Simple loose screws like tripod foot screws that I can just tighten back up. Things like your tripod ring is rattling. It's because an E-clip has come undone inside. I can just take those out. Some loose barrels on like the Canon 7200s, those sometimes are pretty easy.
That's where the screws under the tripod ring, you take the tripod ring off and do.
Same with the old 1635-28.
So to sum up, you'll tighten screws.
I'll tighten screws. Okay. And that's about it.
But you're pretty mechanically inclined. I know you've rebuilt cameras and motorcycles and things, and you limit yourself to tightening screws.
I do, because anything more complex than that is going to take way more time than I have.
That's a good point. Can you think of anything else people could do comfortably at home, Aaron?
Change out some rubbers.
Okay, and that's not a bad thing.
So, I mean, those wear out, they get torn, things happen. It's a very easy thing to do.
Rubbers being the focusing ring, zoom ring.
Yeah, exactly. I would avoid most other things. And that's simply because it's very difficult to make a blanket statement that you can do this type of repair because each lens is going to be ever so slightly different. You may think you can change the weather seal under the lens mount of a particular lens, but what you find when you take the mount off is that, oh no, you've just lost a bunch of shims that were underneath holding that.
Or torn a flex.
You've torn a flex. There. As soon as you go in and attempt to do something very simple without knowing that particular lens.
And for clarity purposes, everybody should be aware if you take a screw out of your own lens that's still in warranty, it's not under warranty if they figure out you did it. And you may think they don't figure it out, but tear a flex and see if they don't. So I think don't ever do a home repair on your under warranty equipment is job one. If the lens is near worthless and you want to play with it, well, that might be worthwhile. But my favorite story of this is a guy who was very excited because he'd bent the bayonet mount, the part of the lens that goes into the camera, and he'd found one on eBay, and it was just taking out 6 screws and replacing it, and he knew he could handle that. And I hated to break to him that mount comes in 15 thicknesses because it's used in place of shims, and he had no idea whether his mount was right or not. So tackling these things at home, I think, is basically a no-do. Maybe in some lenses you could replace a filter element if it's bent and you can find one.
Yeah, usually that's pretty straightforward. But again, how you get to it is different. Some of them have retaining rings. Some of them have rings that are adhered on, and you need to heat them up and pull them off with a special tool without, to avoid scratching the glass. Some of them have screws under the zoom or focus rings, these sorts of things that are easy to access, but you
So the summary
never know
would
what you're
be,
going to find underneath.
if you haven't done it, don't do it.
That seems fair.
Okay.
It's kind of like modern cars. How often do you work on your modern car?
Right. And I could say Aaron and I started doing repairs over a decade ago. One of the ways that we learned how to do repairs was breaking things as we repaired them and learning not to do that again, which is not something most people at home are willing to go through. All right. We've talked about what you could do at home. Are there some repairs that you just kind of look at a lens and go, this is not going to be worth it? We've talked about some that you really couldn't tell if you don't already know that the wide angle zoom requires, an $800 front element. But I'm always interested because a lot of people, my lens is broken half, it can't possibly be fixed. And that often is a simple repair and not that expensive. But are there things that you go, it's just never worth the money for this?
If we know about the sub-assemblies and we know kind of what parts are going to be required, it's helpful because you may look inside your lens and the zoom assembly on the inside, all the glass that moves when you zoom that lens is falling out. Literally glass crashing into it. The next element is scratched. There's lube all over the place. It just looks like a complete mess. But if we know that sub-assembly is not expensive to replace, then we can do that. However, if you know that makes up the majority of the lens, then there's just no point. And that's all maybe due to just a single screw falling out. And the lens is done.
For somebody who doesn't know what parts cost and what repairs take, is there a rule of thumb where you go, this is not worth even sending to the service center? I mean, salt water comes to mind.
Saltwater, Burning Man.
They're just not going to be worth the money.
No, don't take things to Burning Man that you want to keep. Take disposable stuff because it's trashed. It's because it's not just the sand and the dust, but like there's other corrosive elements in that desert stuff. So.
The alkali dust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you start to see that affecting lens coatings, things like that. So if you see fogging or you see fungus building up inside the lens, that's oftentimes no go.
Yeah, you'll see there's been various news reports of service centers somebody finding a lens or something in the ocean years later, and a service center will, for a PR stunt, will go through and clean it all.
Those are mechanical lenses.
Those are mechanical lenses, yes.
Anything else that you just go, other than, it's run over by a truck, that's not even worth considering repairs? Salt water we've got, Burning Man dust or desert dust. Anything else where you just go, don't even worry to send it in?
Maybe if like 2 or more elements are cracked or barrel's broken in half all the way.
Some of the barrels broken in half are real fixable. It's just
depends on
one level.
Yeah.
Crack. I do think it's important that people realize that depending on your brand and what you're dealing with, some places will take a look and let you know, and no harm done if you don't have a repair. Others are going to charge you an examination fee, and you're $100 in to just get your parts back.
But you can call them and find out if they do that. So
yeah, and I think that's always a call worth making.
I think it does. It really does come into play how much you paid for that equipment.
Right.
If you're talking about a $300 lens versus a $1,000 lens, and you have a scratched front element, let's go with the most basic thing. A scratched front element for a $300 lens may be half the price of your lens.
Right. And that repair
maybe the same price for the $1,000 lens. So there's a very big difference there.
You can kind of make a generalization that taking a lens apart is going to take an hour or two at a given rate, whether it's a $300 lens or a $5,000 lens.
Yeah, one thing we didn't talk about earlier was dust, like a dust repair.
You come about cleaning out dust.
Yeah, just cleaning out dust. You're not going to see it. I mean, you can physically see it when you look down into the lens, but you're not going to see it in your images no matter how much you think you might.
This side of a bug, yeah.
Yeah.
Bugs and lenses I've seen.
Bugs and lenses, sure. But any like small amount of dust, even like lots of fine dust, you're probably not seeing much of an impact anyway. So I would say it's not really worth the repair unless you're trying to sell it.
I do think I hear somebody at least every 2 months screaming online about they wanted this much to get the dust out of my lens. Like you think there's a dust port where they plug a vacuum in. That lens has to be completely disassembled, and techs don't make $15 an hour, and there's charges for all the equipment they're using and the space, et cetera. If it's a 4-hour job, it's a 4-hour job.
It's like detailing a car. Like that's not cheap.
And some of those lenses, we do this all the time. The lens, to be disassembled to get the dust out, optical adjusting elements have to be reset afterwards, and the lens may not be optically what it was before it got dusted. Okay, let's see. What else do we need to talk about today? I think the big thing is obviously, what do you do with your equipment so that you don't have to get it repaired? What are basic things people should be doing to prevent being the person that needs to get the $500 repair?
Leave it in bubble wrap in a box. Don't use it.
And then they'll get fungus.
Yeah.
But I think not bubble wrap, but what about padded lens cases or padded camera bags?
Yeah. The more padding you can have, comfortably, obviously, is a great. Try not to bump your lens. Try not to drop anything. Avoid sand and salt. If you're going to be in those kinds of conditions, a plastic bag with some gaff tape, that can be your best friend.
That's the most underutilized piece of, I think, preventative equipment you can have.
Yeah. People ask us I get questions about ring gear all the time. I'm like, yeah, you could buy this expensive thing to cover everything, or you could just grab a garbage bag and some gaff tape and it'll work just as well.
Gallon-sized Ziplocs are fabulous for a lot of things. Mm-hmm. Aaron, you got other things to add? How do you prevent repairs?
I think just, keeping in mind the things that you forget a lot of the time that, you're doing all this to protect the glass. You're keeping it out of certain scenarios with filters and these sorts of things. But don't forget you still need to keep an eye on the rear cap, the front cap, as you're putting them back on the lens. Clean those too. Don't forget about those. Like it's very common that we have this pristine lens come through and, whatever cap gets put on it has sand left over from the past rental. And it's just like, unless you take that out, you're going to end up, that falls on the glass, and the next time you clean it, you have a new scratch.
I got one of those back today.
We've had several lenses over the years that have had spiders or ants or bugs in them. And nobody knows exactly how it got there, but the assumption in almost every case was it was in the rear lens cap and got put on the lens, and then the creature had plenty of time to go crawl through it.
Oh, and always use your hoods. Use lens hoods. They're great. And get insurance.
Good point also. Lens insurance really doesn't bitch much about not, denying a repair.
Yeah, there's some really good policies out there if you shop around. There's organizations that have group policies and stuff too. So,
well, I think we'll call it quits for today. This has been a fun topic for me because it's where I used to make my living, and I hope you've learned something and it was useful for you too. Thanks for listening to the Lensrentals podcast. If you have any questions or comments, let us know at podcast@lensrentals.com. I'll leave you with this quote from Dorothea Lange. The camera is an instrument that teaches people how to see without a camera.